The wind came first, sharp, clean, and cold enough to make the harbor cranes groan. Halifax didn't wake up easily in winter. It crept out of the fog like an old ship, slow and reluctant, the kind of morning where breath turned to glass and silence carried farther than sound. Down by the waterfront, a single light glowed in the third-floor window of a tired brick building. That was where Malcolm Reed started every day before the sun even thought about showing up. He stood in a kitchen that had known better years, paint peeling near the radiator, the smell of salt and burnt toast hanging in the air. The coffee maker hissed like it was angry at the cold. Malcolm didn't rush it. He never rushed anything. At 38, he had learned that speed breaks more than it fixes. He poured the coffee into a chipped mug, the same one he'd used since his days at the shipyard, and stared out the small window toward the ghostly outlines of cranes and containers fading into fog. Behind him, a pencil scratched faintly on paper. Zoe, his 9-year-old daughter, sat cross-legged at the kitchen table, her hair tied into 2 uneven braids. Her school notebook was open to an assignment titled in neat blue letters, "What does home mean?" She chewed her lip as she thought, then looked up. "Dad," she said, "what's home to you?" Malcolm turned from the window. The question landed heavier than she meant it to. He smiled softly, the kind of smile that carried more weariness than joy. "Home," he said after a pause, "is the place you keep standing, even when everything else falls apart." Zoe nodded like she understood, though her eyes told him she was still turning the words over, testing their shape. By 6:15, he was layered in his work jacket, boots laced tight. Zoe waved from the window as he stepped outside, the sky still the color of slate. Snow crunched underfoot, each step echoing in the hush of a city not quite awake. Halifax had once been loud, ship horns, welding sparks, hammer strikes. Now it hummed low, a survivor of its own quiet transformation. The old shipyards were mostly condos. The warehouses had become art studios, and the Haven Foods plant, where Malcolm worked maintenance, was one of the last industrial giants still breathing. He walked the 5 blocks to the factory, past boarded storefronts and old murals fading under salt air. A gull screamed somewhere above, a sound both lonely and defiant. The closer he got, the more he could smell the place. Metal, oil, and the faint sweetness of processed syrup that never quite left the air. The guard at the gate nodded without speaking. Everyone there knew Malcolm, the man who never complained, who fixed things others gave up on, who clocked in early and left late because that's what men like him did. But even loyalty couldn't fix what was coming. Inside, the factory felt like a sleeping animal. Conveyor belts stood still. The fluorescent lights flickered, their hum mixing with the faint hiss of the boiler system. A notice had gone out 2 weeks ago. Haven Foods would be shutting down by spring. Another casualty of outsourcing and automation. But no one talked about it. They just kept showing up, as if routine could stop the inevitable. Malcolm hung his jacket on the same hook he'd used for 8 years. The tag above it still read, "R. Lorne," a man who'd retired before Zoe was born. He'd never replaced the nameplate. Somehow, it felt right that some things stayed anonymous. He made his first inspection round of the morning. Pressure valves, coolant lines, the old furnace that coughed like a smoker. Each click of his wrench sounded like a heartbeat against the hollow quiet. When he passed the break room, he saw a newspaper left open on the table. The headline read, "Halifax transforms. Old industries give way to the future." He stared at it for a long moment, then turned it face down. At the far end of the floor, a faded banner still hung from the ceiling. "Haven Foods, feeding families since 1958. The slogan used to mean something. Now the corners of the banner curled inward, like even the fabric was tired of pretending. Malcolm paused beneath it, running a gloved hand over the cold steel of a machine that once packed 10,000 cans an hour. He could still remember when the place had been alive. Music from radios, lunchboxes clattering, the smell of fried onions from the cafeteria. Back then, you could feel the heartbeat of Halifax in every vibration of the walls. Now it was a ghost of itself, waiting for the lights to go out one last time. He pulled his thermos from his jacket and took a sip. Outside the windows, the first faint blush of dawn touched the harbor. Ships were still moving, but fewer now. The world didn't need as many hands anymore, just algorithms, buttons, and cold efficiency. Malcolm stood there, silent, the light edging across his face, catching the fine lines at the corners of his eyes. He wasn't angry, not yet, just aware. The kind of awareness that comes from watching the slow erosion of a way of life. His phone buzzed, a text from Zoe's teacher reminding parents about career day next week. He typed back, "I'll be there," then slipped the phone away and tightened his gloves. The shift whistle blew, a long, hollow sound that used to signal purpose, but now only echoed loss. As he walked the length of the plant, past rows of silent machines, a single thought rose in him, clear and steady. If this place dies, it won't be because no one cared. It'll be because no one fought to remember why it mattered. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing the faint outline of the harbor bridge, rusted but standing. Malcolm glanced once toward the horizon, then back at the factory doors. The story hadn't begun yet, but something in the cold wind whispered that it would soon. Stay with this story, because sometimes the quietest men carry the loudest truths, and Halifax was about to hear one. By mid-morning, the factory had begun to stir with a kind of nervous energy. Word had spread that the inspection team from Toronto was arriving. Suits from headquarters, people who'd never stepped on the factory floor, but made decisions that shaped the lives of those who did. Floors were swept, safety posters straightened, and even the old vending machine got a wipe down. The air smelled faintly of bleach and anxiety. Malcolm didn't care much for these visits. They came and went every few months, always with polite smiles and clipboards, never staying long enough to learn anyone's name. He just kept his focus on the pipes along the west corridor, a tangle of aging valves that hissed like they were whispering secrets. Steam curled up from one of them, thin and white, a sign of trouble. He crouched down, wrench in hand, and started tightening a joint when a voice drifted over his shoulder. "Good thing we've got diversity hires," one of the maintenance techs said. The man, Greg, grinned toward his buddies across the aisle. "Keeps the stats looking good, eh?" A few quiet chuckles followed, sharp and brittle, the kind that didn't need to be loud to sting. Malcolm didn't look up. He kept turning the wrench, slow and even. His movements were deliberate, controlled, as though each twist was an act of restraint. Across the floor, Clara Whitmore, the young vice president visiting from Toronto, heard the remark. She froze for a second, her clipboard in hand, eyes flicking toward the group. She saw Malcolm's stillness, the way he absorbed the insult without flinching, and felt the air around her tighten. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The moment slipped past, swallowed by the clang of machinery. She told herself she was just an observer today. Don't interfere, keep it professional. Still, something about the silence pressed on her chest as she walked on with the rest of the team, nodding to Greg when he offered a smirking greeting. By noon, the inspection was half done. The Toronto group huddled in the manager's office reviewing data, while workers gathered in the break room, voices low. Malcolm stayed behind on the floor, running diagnostics on the electrical system. The power had been flickering all week, and he didn't trust the aging wiring not to betray them while outsiders were watching. He traced the problem to a circuit panel near the main boiler, a rusted gray box humming too loudly. As he pried it open, a spark leapt out, blue-white and fast. The smell of ozone filled the air. "Damn," he muttered, stepping back. He knew that sound, the hiss of a short waiting to become a fire. He grabbed his insulated gloves, killed the secondary power, and began rerouting the line manually. The factory lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. The hum of the machines returned to its usual rhythm. For a moment, all was calm again. Up on the catwalk, Clara and the plant manager had just returned from lunch when they noticed the near miss. "What happened?" she asked, eyes wide. "Breaker issue," the manager said. "Reed fixed it before it got bad." Clara leaned on the rail, looking down. Malcolm stood below, wiping sweat and dust from his forehead. His shirt had torn near the shoulder from when he jerked back from the spark, the fabric catching on a bolt. She was about to turn away when she saw it, the dark ink etched into his skin. The tattoo was faded, but clear. HMCS St. John's, Afghanistan Tour 2007. Below it, a series of small initials, names, each carefully spaced like a roll call. For a few seconds, the entire floor seemed to still. The chatter near the conveyor belts faded. Greg, the same man who'd made the remark earlier, stood by the locker row staring, color draining from his face. From across the room, one of the older machinists, a heavy-set man with a limp and the quiet bearing of someone who'd seen war, stepped forward. Without a word, he raised his hand and gave a small, trembling salute. Malcolm looked up, surprise flickering across his features, then gave a single nod in return. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was dense, charged, a silence that forced everyone in the room to hear their own thoughts. Clara felt her throat tighten. She remembered the way she'd stayed quiet earlier, telling herself it wasn't her place. Now, looking down at that torn shirt and the names inked into the skin of a man who'd served while others like her built careers in glass towers, she felt the weight of her silence like a stone in her chest. The manager broke the tension with a forced laugh. "Well, good thing Reed was here, huh? Saved us a shutdown." But no one laughed back. Malcolm didn't respond. He just bent down, picked up the wrench that had fallen, and placed it neatly back into his toolkit. Then, as if nothing had happened, he walked toward the far end of the floor to check another valve. As the inspection team prepared to leave, Clara lingered by the doorway. Her reflection in the glass looked pale, uncertain. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft, slow flakes drifting past the smokestacks. She watched Malcolm cross the yard toward the maintenance shed, shoulders squared against the cold. For the first time all day, she saw not just an employee, but a man who carried the weight of service and silence in equal measure. And for reasons she couldn't yet name, that sight unsettled her more than any failed inspection ever could. The factory was nearly empty by the time the wind picked up from the harbor. Most of the workers had gone, their boots leaving damp prints that led toward the parking lot and the promise of warmth. But Malcolm stayed behind. He sat on a metal stool by the window, elbows on his knees, watching the dark water shift beyond the docks. The glass trembled with each gust, carrying the faint scent of salt and diesel. The floor was silent now, except for the low hum of the furnace and the occasional clink of cooling steel. Silence was supposed to be peace, but tonight it felt like distance, like something had pulled tight between him and everyone else. He'd felt it before, in places far from home, where men learned to speak less because words couldn't change what they'd seen. Outside, the snow turned to sleet, needling against the windowpane. Malcolm rubbed his hands together, not to warm them, but to keep them steady. Every now and then, he caught the sound of footsteps in the hallway, someone lingering, thinking about saying something, but no one did. When they passed him by, they didn't meet his eyes. It was as if seeing him meant confronting something uncomfortable, something they'd rather pretend wasn't there. He wasn't angry at them. Not really. Anger was a flame, and flames burned out. What he felt was heavier, a slow, quiet disappointment that settled deep, the kind that didn't shout or demand apology, just stayed. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the old dog tag he kept there. It was scratched and dulled, the letters faint, but still legible. He traced the name with his thumb. R.R. Myers, one of the men he'd served with on the HMCS St. John's. The faces came back in flashes, laughter over instant coffee, the metallic taste of fear before a deployment. the sound of boots on metal decks, and then silence again, the kind that follows loss. He remembered the last time he'd seen Myers, both of them crouched behind a vehicle in a blinding wall of dust and heat. The radio static had been loud, but his friend's voice had been louder. "Keep your head down, Reed. Always down." It was strange how the things that saved you once could hurt later. Now, years and miles away, that same discipline to stay low, to stay quiet, felt less like protection and more like a prison. The clock on the wall ticked past 8. Malcolm finally stood, joints stiff, and turned off the last light. Outside, the wind hit his face sharp as glass. He walked home through narrow streets lined with snowbanks and shuttered stores. The smell of fish and oil lingered in the air, mixed with the faint sweetness of wood smoke from nearby houses. When he reached his building, he paused at the door. From the window above, a small shape moved. Zoe, waiting. Inside, the warmth of the apartment wrapped around him like a blanket that didn't quite reach his shoulders. Zoe sat at the kitchen table, her crayon spread across a page. She looked up as he entered. "You're late," she said softly. "I know," he replied, taking off his boots. She hesitated, watching him pour a cup of leftover coffee, black and lukewarm. Then she asked, "Bah, are people good?" The question stopped him mid-sip. He turned slowly, meeting her eyes. There was no judgment in her voice, only curiosity, as if she'd sensed the storm in him without knowing its shape. He thought of Greg's sneer, of the laughter that died too late, of Clara's silence on the catwalk. He thought of the salute, the one moment of recognition that had cut through it all. Were people good? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Some questions didn't need lies, and he didn't have truth gentle enough for her. So he said nothing. Zoe tilted her head, waiting, then nodded as if she understood anyway. "You're good," she said, and went back to coloring. That night, after she'd fallen asleep, Malcolm sat on the edge of his bed staring at the wall. The faint hum of the old radiator filled the silence. He wanted to believe her. That being good could be that simple. But the world had a way of making good men carry too much. Morning came gray and cold. Frost feathered the corners of the windows. Malcolm brewed coffee again, the ritual steadying him. When his phone buzzed on the counter, he almost didn't look. Then he saw the name, Clara Whitmore. The message was short. "Mr. Reed, I wanted to apologize for yesterday. I heard what was said, and I should have spoken up. You deserved better. I'm sorry." He read it twice, thumb hovering over the screen, then locked the phone and slid it into his pocket. There was nothing cruel in her words. If anything, they were sincere. But sincerity didn't erase silence. At her desk across town, Clara stared at her own screen after hitting send. She didn't expect a reply. The image of Malcolm's torn shirt and the tattoo beneath it had followed her into her dreams, into her morning coffee, into the reflection of herself she barely recognized. She'd built her career on order, numbers, targets, reports, things that made sense. But this quiet reckoning of human decency made her uneasy in a way spreadsheets never could. For the first time in years, she didn't want to fix a problem on paper. She wanted to make something right in the real world. And as the snow fell heavier outside, she found herself whispering into the empty office, "Next time, I won't stay quiet." It was a small promise, but it was where change began. The next morning, the sky over Halifax hung low and pale, as if the light itself was tired. The snow had crusted overnight, crunching under the boots of workers filing into the factory yard. The air bit at their faces, the kind of cold that made conversation short and movements deliberate. Clara Whitmore stood outside her rental car longer than necessary, hands buried in her coat pockets. She could have flown back to Toronto last night. Her part in the inspection was technically done, but something about the silence in that factory, the kind that followed Malcolm Reed wherever he walked, had stayed with her. She wasn't sure what she was doing back there, only that leaving without doing something felt wrong. Inside, the locker room smelled of metal and soap, of wet coats drying too slowly. She found his locker easily. Second row from the left, bottom corner, the one with the tag that still read "R. Lorne." The paint was chipped around the edges, the door slightly dented from years of use. Clara slipped a folded note through the vented slot, her pulse quickening for reasons she didn't fully understand. The words she'd written were simple. You didn't raise your voice, and yet you were heard. No signature, no title, just that. Then she left, quietly as she came, the note settling into the dimness like a whisper. When Malcolm arrived later, the day had already begun its weary rhythm, the clang of steel, the hiss of valves, the shuffle of boots across concrete. He opened his locker, expecting nothing but the usual smell of oil and old gloves. The paper fluttered to the floor. He frowned, picked it up, and read the line. Once, then again. The words were simple, but something in them struck deeper than he wanted to admit. He folded the note with care and slid it into his worn leather wallet, tucking it beside a photo of Zoe grinning with 2 missing teeth. For a moment, he allowed himself a breath that wasn't guarded. Then he shut the locker and went to work. Over the next few days, people noticed changes that didn't make sense at first. The young vice president, usually seen in meetings or walking briskly between offices, began spending time on the floor. No entourage, no clipboard. She asked questions, not the kind meant for reports, but the kind meant to understand. Does this machine always stick? How often do you replace the coolant line? What happens when it doesn't? At first, the workers answered cautiously, waiting for a catch, but Clara didn't correct them or talk over them. She just listened, nodded, sometimes took notes, sometimes didn't. When the shift whistle blew one evening, she stayed behind, hands still cold from the draft that leaked through the loading bay. From the corner of her eye, she saw Malcolm talking to one of the new hires, a young man named Ravi, barely 20, freshly arrived from Mumbai. Ravi was trying to maneuver a crate onto a dolly, struggling with the weight and balance. The crate wobbled, tilted toward the ledge. "Stop, don't fight it," Malcolm said, stepping forward. He caught the edge before it toppled and lowered it back into place. "You don't pull from the top. You guide from the base. Like this." Ravi's face was red, a mix of embarrassment and cold. "Sorry, sir. I thought—" Malcolm shook his head. "Don't call me sir, just slow down. Here." He positioned the handle, showing how to brace with his leg, how to move with the machine, not against it. Within minutes, the boy had the crate moving smoothly across the floor. Clara watched from near the stairs unnoticed. There was no grand speech, no reprimand, just patience. A quiet authority that filled the space without claiming it. When the job was done, Ravi smiled shyly. "Thank you. I'll get it right next time." "You already did," Malcolm said, wiping his hands on a rag. Clara felt something twist inside her. She had led teams, managed budgets, signed contracts worth millions. But watching that small exchange, the respect it built without a single title involved, she realized she'd never seen leadership so pure. The following afternoon, she approached him near the tool bench. He was recalibrating a pressure valve, eyes focused. "I saw what you did yesterday," she said. He didn't look up. "What was that?" "Helping the new kid. You were patient." He adjusted the gauge, tested the lever. "Patience keeps people alive," he replied simply. Clara hesitated. "You used to serve, didn't you? Navy." He gave a short nod. "Long time ago." "Do you ever miss it?" He paused, the wrench still in his hand. "Sometimes I miss the clarity. Out there, you knew what mattered. Here." He shrugged. "It's harder to tell." She wanted to say something, that he was wrong, that what he did still mattered, but the words caught in her throat. So instead, she just nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Reed." He glanced at her then, eyes calm, but unreadable. "For what?" "For showing up," she said quietly. and walked away before she could explain herself. That night, as the factory lights dimmed and the last of the workers clocked out, Clara lingered by the exit. From across the floor, she saw Malcolm slip his gloves into his back pocket and head toward the door, shoulders squared against the cold wind sneaking through the gap. For the first time since arriving in Halifax, she didn't feel like a visitor. She felt like someone learning how to listen. And though she didn't know it yet, that small, folded note, tucked beside a photo of a little girl, had already begun to build a bridge between two people who lived in the same silence for different reasons. The news came on a Wednesday. No warning, no meeting filled with numbers and explanations, just an email from headquarters stamped urgent corporate update. Within an hour, the plant manager was standing on a crate in the break room, reading words that weren't his voice cracking halfway through the statement. Haven Foods' Halifax division would be permanently closing operations, effective in 4 weeks. All employees to receive severance and transition support. For a moment, no one moved. Then came the sounds, the air leaving people's lungs, a few muttered curses, one woman quietly sobbing into her gloves, the sound of decades collapsing into a paragraph. Malcolm stood near the back of the room, arms crossed, face unreadable. He had been through worse: explosions, loss, the sound of things ending too soon. But this kind of ending was quieter, more personal, the kind that didn't echo. It just lingered. Someone kicked a chair, another stormed out. The manager mumbled something about global, restructuring, words that meant nothing to anyone with calluses on their hands. Across the room, Clara looked up from her phone, her stomach sinking as she read the same email. She'd been copied on it, but not consulted. Her title was still shiny, but clearly decorative. She walked toward the manager, voice low but sharp. When was this decided? Last quarter, he admitted, not meeting her eyes. Toronto made the call. Numbers didn't add up. You're shutting down the only site that's still producing at capacity. Margins, Whitmore. It's not about output. It's about cost. This place bleeds maintenance. Her jaw tightened. Then fix it. Don't erase it. The manager sighed, already defeated. It's not your call. She felt her pulse hammer behind her eyes. Not your call. The phrase stung because it was true. She had power on paper, but not where it counted. Malcolm went back to his station the same way a soldier goes back to a battlefield after the last shot, not to fight, just to collect what's left. He packed slowly. Gloves, wrench, the small thermos Zoe had painted with stickers. The silence around him was thick, punctuated only by the scrape of metal on concrete. No one said much. Some stared at him like they expected a reaction. Anger, outrage, something to make them feel less alone. But Malcolm only nodded when someone passed by, steady as ever. When he reached his locker, he paused. The note from Clara was still tucked in his wallet, the crease soft from being handled. He touched it once briefly, then slipped it back. As he turned to leave, Greg, the same man whose words had started everything weeks ago, muttered from the corner, "Guess diversity didn't save us after all." Malcolm stopped, looked at him once, and said quietly, "No one ever said it would." Then he walked out. That evening, the city seemed too quiet. The harbor crane stood motionless against a pink-gray sky. Malcolm climbed the stairs to his apartment, the old steps groaning beneath his boots. Inside, the smell of tomato soup filled the kitchen. Zoe was at the table, drawing again, this time a picture of a lighthouse. "Hey, Bug," he said, hanging up his coat. She looked up, eyes bright. "You're home early." He smiled, pulling out a chair. "Yeah, things are changing at work." Her crayon hovered mid-air. Bad changing or good changing? He thought about the question, about what she could carry and what she couldn't. "Just changing," he said gently. "We're turning a page, starting a new chapter." Zoe frowned in concentration, as if flipping through a book in her head, like when the story gets quiet for a bit. "Exactly." She nodded, seemingly satisfied. Then maybe the next part's better. Malcolm reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. Maybe it is. Across town, Clara sat in her hotel room with her laptop open but untouched. The email from headquarters still glared from the screen, full of words she'd once used herself: strategic alignment, fiscal sustainability, operational redundancy. They'd never sounded so empty. She had tried to argue on the call earlier that afternoon, tried to explain the human cost, the community built around the plant, the veterans who found second lives there, the quiet man who led without a title. But the faces on the other end of the screen had been polite, expressionless. When she finished, the CFO simply said, "Clara, you're too emotionally attached. It's business." She'd muted herself before she said something she couldn't take back. Now, alone in the dim room, she stared at her reflection in the dark window. For years, she'd believed in the system, that logic and data could coexist with compassion if you just tried hard enough. But tonight, the balance had finally tipped. She closed the laptop, reached for her phone, and hovered over Malcolm's name in the company directory. Then she stopped. What could she possibly say? "I'm sorry they erased your livelihood while I watched." Instead, she opened her email to HR and began typing. Effective immediately, I resigned from my position as Vice President of Operations. Some things are worth more than cost savings. Her fingers trembled as she hit send. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt something close to clarity. The same kind of clarity Malcolm had spoken about days earlier, the kind that cuts through the noise. Later that night, she drove by the factory one last time. The yard lights glowed dimly, snow swirling through the beams. Through the frosted windows, she could see a single figure still inside, sweeping near the workbench. Malcolm, steady as ever, closing out the day. She parked across the street and sat there, watching him move, one man holding his ground in a place the world had already written off. And in that quiet Halifax night, Clara understood what debt really meant. Not the kind owed in money or favors, but the kind you carry when someone's integrity exposes the cracks in your own. She whispered to herself, "I owe him more than an apology." And somewhere deep down, she already knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was the turning of a page. A week passed before their paths crossed again. Halifax had that kind of quiet where days bled into each other, gray skies, slow mornings, and the faint smell of salt and diesel that never quite left the air. The Haven Foods building still stood by the harbor, its windows boarded, the sign half fallen. For most, it was already part of the past, but for Clara Whitmore, it was the beginning of something she couldn't yet name. She found Malcolm in a corner cafe near Barrington Street, the kind of place that smelled like roasted beans and old pine. He was sitting by the window with a mug of black coffee, reading the classifieds. His jacket was draped over the chair beside him, worn at the seams. "Mr. Reed," she said softly, approaching. He looked up, surprised but not startled. "Ms. Whitmore, didn't expect to see you this side of the harbor. Can I sit?" He gestured to the chair. "It's a free country." She smiled faintly, settling in. For a few seconds, the only sound was the hiss of the espresso machine and the faint chatter of a couple by the counter. "I owe you an apology," she began. "You already gave one," he replied. "This one's different." She leaned forward, voice low. "I didn't just stand by while they shut the plant down. I quit because it was wrong." Malcolm didn't respond right away. He took a slow sip of coffee, eyes steady on hers. "That's a start," he said finally. Clara exhaled, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled a folder from her bag. "I've been working on something. A proposal. What if we didn't let the building die? What if we turned it into something that actually gave back to the people it failed?" Malcolm's brow furrowed. "You mean like another factory?" "Not exactly." She opened the folder. Diagrams, rough plans, handwritten notes. A renewable energy training and production center, solar panels, wind tech, small-scale manufacturing. A place where veterans, laid-off workers, immigrants, anyone willing to learn can train and build a trade again. Halifax could be the pilot site. Malcolm studied the sketches. The words "Foundry of Renewal" were scribbled across the top of one page. "You'd need funding," he said quietly. "I've started calls," she replied. "There are grants for green development, partnerships for skills retraining. But I need someone who actually understands how to make it work. Someone who knows what it's like to fix things with their hands and fix people without making speeches." Malcolm looked up at her. The weight of the past week still lingered in his shoulders. "You want me to run it?" "I want you to help build it," she corrected. "From the ground up, the right way this time." He leaned back, crossing his arms. "You don't need me, Ms. Whitmore. You need a committee." "I've seen committees," she said softly. "They don't build anything but meetings." For the first time, a hint of a smile tugged at his mouth. "And what makes you think I'd say yes?" "Because you already care about the people who used to walk those floors," she said. "And because I think you're tired of watching things break." That one landed. He didn't answer. Instead, he looked out the window. The snow outside had begun to melt, streaking down the glass in uneven lines like a wall being slowly washed clean. After a long pause, he said quietly, "Projects like this, they look good on paper. Then the money dries up, people move on, and the ones left behind are the same ones who started with nothing. I've seen it." "I know," Clara said. "That's why we need someone who doesn't quit when it gets messy." He stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "I'll think about it." That evening, Malcolm sat at the kitchen table, his toolbox open beside him. Zoe was sprawled on the floor with her crayons, humming softly. She held up a drawing, crooked lines, bright colors, a big figure in a work shirt standing beside a machine. Above it, in uneven letters, she'd written, "Dad fixes broken things." Malcolm stared at the words for a long time. The phrase echoed in his chest, quiet but insistent. Fixing things. That's all he'd ever done. Broken pipes, broken machines, broken chances. Maybe this was just another one, only bigger. "Is that me?" he asked, pretending to tease. Zoe grinned. "Of course. Who else fixes stuff when it's broken?" He smiled, but it faded slowly as he looked back at the picture. The next morning, the phone rang just after sunrise. "It's Clara." Her voice came through the line, calm but hopeful. "Did you think about it?" "I did." And he looked out the window at the half-frozen harbor, at the sunlight glinting weakly off the water. "You're asking me to build something that lasts?" "I'm asking you to help people stand again," she said. He hesitated, then quietly, "All right, let's see if it can be done." Clara didn't respond for a moment, and when she did, her voice softened. "Then we start today." Malcolm hung up, slipped the drawing Zoe had made into his jacket pocket, and grabbed his old work gloves. Outside, the wind had shifted, still cold, but carrying something new. Not a storm, a beginning. The first hammer struck metal like a heartbeat, then another, and another. Within a week, the long-abandoned Haven Foods factory began to breathe again, not with machines, but with people. Paint cans lined the walls, extension cords snaked across the floor, and every echo in that cavernous space carried something new. Hope, tentative, but real. Malcolm stood by the entrance, gloves in his hands, surveying the skeleton of what would one day become the Renewal Works Training Center. The name wasn't official, but it was the one Clara had written in neat, deliberate letters across a whiteboard by the door. They had no investors yet, no polished signage or corporate banners, just a handful of people who believed in starting before waiting for permission. Luis was the first to show up, a wiry electrician from El Salvador with weathered hands and a quiet grin. He had worked odd jobs around the city since losing his license papers in a bureaucratic maze. Old wires, old city, he said, prying open a fuse box. But current still flows if you treat it right. Ellen, a retired science teacher with kind eyes behind thick glasses, arrived next, carrying a thermos and a box of old safety goggles. If you want people to learn here, she told Clara, you need someone who knows how to explain torque and patience. Then came Farah, a 23-year-old environmental engineering student from Dalhousie University. Her notebook was filled with diagrams and wild ideas: rooftop solar, wind mini turbines, sustainable insulation. If we can get this running, she said breathlessly, this building could power half the block. Malcolm didn't say much at first. He worked. He sanded down rails, replaced rusted bolts, reinforced the old loading dock. His movements, as always, were calm and measured, each one a small defiance against the idea that this place was finished. Clara handled the endless calls, city permits, zoning forms, emails filled with bureaucratic language about budget reallocation and delayed assessment timelines. Every message seemed to end with the same phrase: please be patient. But patience didn't build walls. By mid-February, the building had power in half its circuits, a working boiler, and a roof that no longer leaked, all done by volunteers. Yet when Clara went to the municipal office for the inspection, she was met with polite smiles and veiled dismissal. We admire your initiative, one council member said, but the paperwork is incomplete, and we're operating under fiscal constraints. She bit her tongue to keep from laughing bitterly. Fiscal constraints, the same words that had shut down the factory in the first place. When she told Malcolm later that evening, his jaw tightened. They're waiting for us to quit, he said simply. Then we don't, Clara replied. He nodded once, then said something that made her pause. If they won't come see the work, we'll bring the work to them. The next morning, Malcolm called up a local journalist he'd met years ago at a veterans job fair. You still write those community stories? He asked. Only the ones that matter, the man replied. 2 days later, a reporter and a young photographer arrived at the site. They walked through the old plant, snapping photos of paint-splattered hands, mismatched tools, and a small girl's drawing taped to the wall. Zoe's sketch of her dad fixing a giant broken sun. Malcolm spoke little during the interview, just answered questions in his even, thoughtful tone. When asked why he was doing this, he simply said, because people like us built this city once, and no one told us we couldn't do it again. The article appeared the following Sunday in the Chronicle Herald. The headline stretched across the front of the community section. A black single father rebuilds what the city forgot. The story told of a man who refused to let decay define his home, of a group of strangers who turned their grief into purpose, of a vision born not in boardrooms, but in calloused hands and shared coffee. It spread faster than Clara expected. Within hours, people began stopping by the old factory, some just to see it, others to offer help. A contractor dropped off leftover drywall. A cafe owner sent sandwiches. A group of veterans volunteered to clear debris. By dusk, the once empty parking lot was full of cars and voices. Malcolm stood by the loading dock, watching as Luis and Farah debated wiring plans. Ellen organized donated supplies, and Clara coordinated volunteers with a clipboard that was quickly running out of space. For the first time since the shutdown, laughter echoed through the building. Not forced, not polite, genuine laughter that filled the cold air and made the place feel alive again. Clara walked up beside him, brushing dust from her coat. You started something, she said. Malcolm shook his head. No, we remembered something. What's that? That this city still belongs to the people who build it. He turned toward the noise, the drills, the chatter, Zoe running through puddles of melting snow with a paint roller twice her size. And for the first time in months, he allowed himself to smile. That night, after everyone left, Malcolm lingered alone in the half-lit space. The article lay folded on a table, the ink smudged from someone's fingerprints. He ran his hand over the headline, not for pride, but to feel the weight of it. He thought about the words, "A black, single father." He didn't resent them. They were true. But he hoped that one day people would stop being surprised that men like him built things too. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the lights from the harbor shimmered on the wet pavement. Halifax was still cold, still uncertain, but inside that warehouse, under flickering bulbs and tired hands, something was growing. Not just a project, not just a building, a promise. The fire began just before dawn, the hour when Halifax was still wrapped in mist, when even the seagulls hadn't yet begun to scream. At first, it was only a flicker of orange behind the warehouse windows. Then it grew, fast and hungry, devouring the shadows that had lingered there for decades. Malcolm smelled the smoke before he saw it. He was jogging his usual route along the harbor when the wind shifted and brought with it the sharp, bitter scent of burning paint. His heart clenched. There was only one building left in that direction that still meant something. He ran. By the time he reached the Renewal Works site, the back half of the factory was already alive with flame. The roof hissed and crackled as heat met winter frost. In the chaos of smoke and firelight, he saw the night guard, Kenji, stumbling out, coughing violently. Malcolm grabbed him by the arm and pulled him clear, wrapping his own jacket around the man's shoulders. "You all right?" Malcolm shouted. Kenji nodded weakly, eyes wide with shock. "Someone broke the window. I heard glass, then fire. I tried to stop it, but—" His voice broke. Malcolm didn't wait for more. He grabbed the extinguisher by the door and charged back in. The heat was brutal, clawing at his face, but he pushed forward, spraying at the edges, keeping the fire from spreading to the generator room. He worked until the extinguisher hissed empty, then used a hose from outside, his hands numb from cold and adrenaline. When the fire trucks finally arrived, the worst had been contained. The main wall was blackened and blistered, the mural Zoe had once painted nearly gone. Only a faint outline of a sun remained. The smell of melted plastic and smoke clung to everything. Clara arrived minutes later, still in her coat from the night before. Her heels sank into the slush as she stepped through the debris. She didn't speak. She just stood there, staring at the wall, her breath visible in the cold. "They'll call it vandalism," she said quietly. "They always do when it's hate." Malcolm didn't answer. He was staring at the charred letters of a safety sign half melted on the wall. Caution. Flammable materials. Ironic, he thought, as if warning ever stopped fire when it wanted to burn. Firefighters moved around them, finishing their checks, writing reports. One of them, an older woman with gray hair tucked under her helmet, patted Malcolm on the shoulder. "You saved that man's life," she said. "Could have been much worse." He nodded once. Could have been better, too. By noon, news vans had already arrived. Clara tried to turn them away, but the story had a life of its own. The same city that had ignored them when they built now wanted to film their ruins. Malcolm, still covered in soot, stood apart from the cameras. When a reporter tried to ask for comment, he simply said, "Come back when you're ready to help, not when you're ready to film." That afternoon, the volunteers returned. Luis with burned gloves, Ellen with tears in her eyes, Farah clutching a notebook still smelling of smoke. They didn't ask who did it. They didn't waste time on blame. They just started sweeping. Malcolm picked up a roller brush, dipped it into a bucket of white paint, and walked toward the blackened wall. The others watched as he began painting over the char, layer after layer, the strokes slow and deliberate. Clara joined him silently, grabbing another brush. When the wall was covered in clean white, she stepped back and asked softly, "What do we put here?" Malcolm stared at the blank expanse. Then he took a piece of chalk from Farah's kit and wrote in large, rough letters across the center, "Everyone belongs." He stood there for a moment, chalk still in hand, his breathing heavy in the cold air. Then he underlined it once. No slogans, no branding, just truth. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Ellen murmured, "We should keep it like that." Luis nodded. "See, simple but strong." Clara looked at the words, her throat tight. "It's more than a message," she said. "It's a promise." Malcolm didn't reply, but his eyes softened. That night, photos of the wall began to spread across social media. Someone had posted it under the headline, "From Ashes, a Message, Everyone Belongs." Within hours, people were sharing it across Halifax, then across the province. The next morning, the parking lot was full again, not with reporters this time, but with neighbors. People brought coffee, blankets, paint, and food. A local church arrived with volunteers. Students came after class, some carrying signs that read, "We stand with the Foundry." The name stuck. By the end of the week, the charred remains of renewal works had become something larger, the Foundry of Hope. No one planned the rebranding. It simply happened, born out of loss and rebuilt through unity. Malcolm worked alongside everyone, hammering new frames, cleaning soot, replacing windows. But he wasn't alone anymore. Every swing of a hammer, every brush of paint was echoed by dozens of others. Even city officials, embarrassed by the publicity, showed up to express support. Clara let them speak, smile for cameras, and hand over their token grant check. But when they left, she turned to Malcolm and whispered, "They're late to the story, but at least they showed up." He grinned faintly. Better late than never. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the harbor cranes, Malcolm and Zoe stood in front of the new wall. The letters gleamed gold under the setting light. "Everyone belongs," Zoe read aloud. "That means me too, right?" Malcolm smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Especially you." She leaned against him, and together they watched the colors shift. The sky, the paint, the light. The wall that had burned now glowed like a beacon. It wasn't perfect, but it stood. And sometimes, in a world that burns too easily, standing is the bravest thing of all. The weeks that followed the fire became a blur of motion, color, and grit. By dawn, hammers rang where silence once ruled. The smell of ash was slowly replaced by the scent of wet paint and sawdust. Every day, more people showed up. Neighbors, students, veterans, mothers with kids in tow. It didn't matter where they came from. The Foundry of Hope had become a magnet for anyone who wanted to build something that stood for good in a world that too often looked away. Malcolm led quietly. He didn't bark orders or make speeches. He just worked. And somehow, that quiet steadiness pulled people into rhythm around him. A local filmmaker started capturing the process, a slow montage of Halifax's heart beating again. Luis rewiring lights while humming an old Spanish hymn. Farah sketching solar layouts on a clipboard smudged with paint. Ellen teaching a group of teens how to use a level properly. Patience is half the job, she laughed. And Zoe, little Zoe, became the soul of the rebuild. She and the other neighborhood kids dipped their palms into bright paint and pressed them against the wall beneath the words, "Everyone belongs." Red, blue, yellow, green, a living mural of hands reaching upward. When one boy hesitated, afraid of getting dirty, Zoe grinned and said, "It's not dirt, it's proof." The photo of those painted hands made the front page of the Chronicle Herald again. The headline read, "After the fire, how one community rebuilds hope, one wall at a time." That's when the calls began. News stations, radio hosts, community groups. Everyone wanted to talk to Malcolm Reed, the quiet leader of the Foundry of Hope. The phrase stuck. It wasn't something he ever asked for, but somehow it fit. When people spoke to him, they didn't find a politician or an activist. They found a man who listened before speaking, who fixed what was broken without needing applause. One morning, a letter arrived from City Hall. Clara opened it, scanning quickly, then looked up at him with a half smile. "They're inviting you to speak," she said. "Speak?" Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "At where?" "The next council meeting. They're reviewing community redevelopment policies. They want your input." Malcolm chuckled softly. "Guess they finally realized blueprints don't build cities. People do." Clara tilted her head. "Will you go?" He shrugged. "I'll go, but I'm not dressing up." The day of the meeting, Halifax's council chamber was bright and sterile, all polished wood and microphones that made every word sound important. The rows were filled. City officials, reporters, and ordinary citizens, many of whom had helped repaint the Foundry. Malcolm sat quietly at the back until his name was called. He stood, adjusting his jacket, the same one still faintly smelling of smoke, and walked to the podium. The room hushed. He looked around before speaking. "I'm not a man of speeches," he began, voice calm, steady. "Most of my life, I've worked behind walls, fixing things most folks don't notice until they break." He paused, eyes moving across the room. "A few months ago, those walls caught fire, but what burned wasn't just wood and paint. It was the illusion that someone else would come fix what's broken." A murmur rippled through the room. Malcolm continued, "We rebuilt, not because we had funding or headlines, but because people showed up. Electricians, teachers, kids, strangers. And what I learned is simple." He leaned forward slightly. "If you want to rebuild a city, start by calling people by their names, not by their labels." He let the words hang there. The chamber was utterly still. "When you call someone by a label," he said softly, "you tell them who they're supposed to be. But when you call them by their name, you remind them who they already are. Capable, worthy, needed." He straightened, eyes steady but warm. "That's what we did at the Foundry. We called each other by name, and that's how a burned building became a place of belonging." No one moved. Then a single person began to clap. Ellen from the back row, her eyes bright. Then Luis joined, then Farah, then everyone. The sound grew, echoing off the chamber walls like the pounding of hammers on steel. Clara, sitting near the front, felt her chest tighten with something between pride and relief. For months, she'd carried guilt, the weight of her silence that first day in the factory. But watching Malcolm now, she realized he had never needed her to save him. He just needed a world that finally heard him. That evening, back at the Foundry, the team gathered to celebrate. Someone brought homemade soup, someone else played a guitar. The laughter rolled through the open doors into the cool Halifax night. Malcolm sat on the steps, a paper cup of coffee in hand, watching the glow of light spill out onto the street. Zoe sat beside him, head resting against his arm. "Did they like your speech?" she asked sleepily. He smiled. "I think they did." "What did you say?" He looked up at the mural, dozens of handprints now shining under the lamplight, and repeated softly, "I told them if they want to rebuild the city, they should start by calling people by their names, not their labels." Zoe blinked, considering. "That's what you do, right?" "What's that?" "You call people by their names, even when they forget their own." Malcolm turned to her, smiling faintly. "Guess that's part of fixing things, too." Inside, Clara's laughter carried through the doorway, joined by Farah's and Luis's voices arguing cheerfully over whose wiring was straighter. The Foundry of Hope pulsed with life again, rebuilt not just in brick and paint, but in spirit. And as the cold night wrapped around Halifax, the man they called the quiet leader sat under the faint hum of streetlights, feeling something rare and powerful. Not victory, not pride, but peace. Because for the first time in a long time, he knew. What they had built wasn't just a building. It was recognition. The days that followed were gentler, a rare stillness settling over Halifax after the echoes of applause. The Foundry thrived again, humming with life and purpose. Volunteers returned to their routines. Children painted new handprints over old ones. And for a while, everything felt steady, like the city had exhaled after holding its breath too long. Yet peace, Malcolm knew, was never permanent. It came like the tide, generous, then pulling back to test what remained standing. A week later, on a gray Monday morning, Clara walked into the foundry carrying an envelope, thick paper, embossed seal, the kind that never brought good news. She laid it on the table between them. "They're calling it redevelopment," she said quietly. "But what it really means," she hesitated, eyes heavy, "is they want the land." The letter arrived on a Monday, crisp white paper, embossed with a corporate logo that gleamed like a warning. Clara read it twice before saying a word. "They're calling it redevelopment," she said finally, sliding the page across the table to Malcolm. "But what it really means is they want the land." Malcolm read the words carefully, lips pressed thin. Maritime Growth Partners, a real estate consortium, proposed to buy the entire block, the foundry, the adjacent lots, even the small park across the street. The plan: demolish, rebuild, and revitalize Halifax industrial waterfront. The same language, Malcolm thought grimly, that had been used to erase communities for decades. "Do they have the authority?" he asked. "They have money," Clara replied. "That's almost the same thing." Outside, the first hints of spring touched the air, melting the last of the harbor frost. Inside, the foundry hummed, kids painting, volunteers sanding benches, Farah testing a solar panel by the window. The space pulsed with purpose, warmth, life. Malcolm folded the letter and tucked it into his jacket. "Then we'll see if Halifax still remembers what life looks like." Within a week, the news broke. A front-page article titled "Developer's Eye Community Land for Waterfront Expansion" sparked a wave of outrage. For every voice supporting economic growth, 10 more rose in defense of the foundry. Still, the city scheduled a public hearing, the kind that looked fair but often wasn't, the kind where decisions were made long before the microphones turned on. On the morning of the hearing, the sky over Halifax was the color of pewter, heavy, uncertain. The council chamber was packed. Residents, students, church groups, veterans, teachers, even construction workers still in their boots. At the back, a hand-painted banner hung quietly. "The Foundry Stands." Malcolm sat beside Clara, his hands clasped. Across the aisle, the developers, sharp suits, expensive smiles, whispered to lawyers and lobbyists. The tension in the room was like static before a storm. The council chair, a woman with iron gray hair and a voice of procedure, opened the session. "We will now hear statements regarding the proposed redevelopment of Parcel 14A, commonly known as the Foundry site." One by one, speakers approached the podium. Luis spoke first, his accent thick, but his conviction clear. "This place gave me back my work, my dignity. You can't build that with blueprints." Ellen followed, holding up a folder of student projects. "These kids learned science here. They learned community. What you're proposing to tear down isn't a building. It's a classroom." Farah stepped forward next, her hand shaking, but her voice firm. "The foundry is not outdated. It's the future. Renewable, sustainable, human." Each testimony rippled through the chamber like waves against rock. Yet the developers remained unmoved, confident in their polished presentations and promises of new jobs and modern facilities. Finally, the chair called, "Mr. Malcolm Reed." The room stilled. Cameras turned. Malcolm rose slowly, straightening the jacket that still bore a faint scorch mark from the fire. He walked to the podium, not hurried, not timid, just steady, the way he always moved. He adjusted the microphone and began. "I'm not here to argue against progress," he said. "I'm here to remind you what progress is supposed to mean." He paused, letting the silence settle. This land used to be a factory, a place that built things with steel and sweat. Then it was abandoned. People walked past it for years, saying someone should do something. We did. A few nods from the back. Clara's hand tightened around her pen. "We built something different," Malcolm continued. "Not for profit, for people, for veterans, for newcomers, for kids who needed a place to believe they belonged. And when it burned, we rebuilt it together. He looked at the council directly now. And now you want to replace it, not because it failed, but because it succeeded in a way that doesn't fit your spreadsheets. The developer's lawyer shifted in his chair. Malcolm didn't blink. You can rezone land, he said quietly. Then, leaning forward, his voice deepened. But can you rezone hearts? The room froze. You can measure square footage, he went on, but not belonging. You can count revenue, but not the sound of laughter echoing through a rebuilt hall. You can draft a plan, but you can't buy what we built with bare hands and open hearts. A long pause. Then someone clapped, then another, and another, until the chamber erupted in applause, loud, insistent, unstoppable. Even some of the council members joined in, their composure cracking under the surge of emotion. Clara looked over at him, tears caught in her lashes. Malcolm just nodded once, a soldier acknowledging a battle fought the right way. After nearly an hour of debate, the council called for a vote. Hands raised one by one. The majority leaned toward the side of the people. When the final count was announced, the chair smiled faintly. By majority vote, the Halifax City Council recognizes the Foundry of Hope as a designated community innovation zone. The property will remain in community stewardship. The room exploded in cheers. Louise hugged Ellen. Farah covered her mouth in disbelief. Clara laughed, the kind of laugh that breaks through exhaustion and lands in joy. Malcolm exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for a moment. It wasn't victory he felt. Not exactly. It was vindication. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds for the first time that week, casting light over the harbor. Reporters swarmed, but Malcolm slipped away quietly, walking toward the waterfront. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of salt and renewal. Behind him, people celebrated, their voices rising like music. He stopped, looked back once at the city that had almost forgotten him, and smiled. Halifax would go on, as cities always do, but for once, it was doing so with its heart intact. And at the center of it all stood the Foundry of Hope, fire-scarred, rebuilt, and unshakably alive. The days after the hearing passed like the calm after a storm. The Foundry stood, not just by law now, but by love. Its walls still marked by soot and fingerprints, its halls alive with the murmur of belonging. Word spread across Halifax. The people had won. But for Malcolm, victory wasn't celebration, it was responsibility. He spent mornings walking the length of the building, tracing the scars left by fire and time. Each burn mark, each rusted bolt, reminded him what it meant to endure, to build something that could not be sold or moved. Clara visited often, her sleeves rolled, plans in hand, though this time there were no boardrooms or deadlines, only purpose. Together they began again. Spring crept in quietly, washing the last of winter's gray from the harbor. The ice melted along the docks, and the air carried the faint scent of wet soil, of beginnings. And under that soft Halifax light, the work resumed. Spring arrived in Halifax like a slow exhale. The wind off the harbor carried not salt and rust anymore, but the faint scent of new paint and thawing earth. The old factory, once a skeleton of metal and regret, now pulsed with quiet life, not the roar of machines, but the hum of conversation, laughter, and purpose. Inside the Foundry of Hope, the morning light spilled through tall windows that hadn't seen daylight in decades. Dust motes drifted like tiny stars, and where once conveyor belts had groaned, now stood tables lined with tools, solar batteries, and coffee mugs half full of warmth. Malcolm walked the length of the floor, clipboard in one hand, a wrench in the other. His steps were slow, steady, filled with the kind of peace that comes only after surviving the storm. Behind him, the soft whir of a turbine joined the chatter of volunteers testing circuits. Across the room, Clara crouched beside a panel of gauges, her hair tied back, sleeves rolled. "Steam pressure stable," she called out, tapping the dial. "Solar feed running clean." Malcolm leaned over her shoulder, checking the readings. "You'd make a decent engineer, Whitmore." She shot him a look, half amused. "You mean better than a corporate executive?" He smirked. "Let's call it an upgrade." They both laughed, not the polite kind of laughter they'd once shared, but something easier, truer. Around them, the community buzzed. Farah teaching a group of students about sustainable circuits, Louis running a safety demo, Ellen setting up a literacy corner near the break area. It wasn't a factory anymore. It was a heartbeat. Outside, the air shimmered faintly from the new steam-solar hybrid system that powered the building. Pipes hissed softly, carrying recycled heat through the halls. Panels along the roof caught the sunlight, and small turbines spun like watchful sentinels in the breeze. "This place used to run on exhaustion," Clara said quietly, looking up at the spinning blades. "Now it runs on hope." Malcolm nodded, his gaze steady. "And discipline. Hope without work doesn't hold." He wiped his hands on a rag, eyes landing on the far corner of the courtyard, where an old rusted sign leaned against the wall, a relic from the Haven Foods days. The paint had nearly flaked off, but faint letters still clung to the metal. "Efficiency first." He stared at it for a long moment. Then, wordlessly, he walked over, lifted the sign, and began cleaning it with a cloth soaked in oil. Clara watched as he scraped away the corrosion, careful, patient. When he was done, he took a small metal stencil and painted new words across the surface in black, bold letters. "Integrity keeps us standing." He set the sign against the wall again, now reborn, its message simple and whole. "That's better," Clara murmured. Malcolm just smiled. "Machines fall apart, metal bends, but if you build on integrity, it lasts." Later that afternoon, the foundry filled with visitors, families, students, city officials, even the mayor. The newly approved Community Innovation Zone was officially launching, though no one called it a ceremony. It felt more like a neighborhood gathering. Coffee cups, handshakes, music from an old radio in the corner. Zoe sat at a small table near the front, hunched over her homework. The light from the tall windows poured across the floor, landing perfectly on her face, soft, golden, alive. Every so often she'd glance up, watching her father talk with volunteers, his laughter low and genuine. The sunlight reflected off the polished metal pipes behind him, scattering across the room like fragments of promise. When the guests had gone and the day began to dim, Malcolm and Clara walked one last round through the factory. The hum of the generators faded into the rhythmic sound of footsteps and distant gulls. They stopped near the main entrance, where the old rusted sign gleamed faintly under the new lighting. Clara brushed her fingers across the fresh paint. "You built this," she said softly. Malcolm shook his head, eyes warm but firm. "No," he said. "We just remembered how." Outside, the sky over Halifax turned amber and violet, the kind of light that lingers just long enough to make people believe in second chances. Inside, the foundry glowed, a monument not to perfection, but to perseverance. And as the lights flickered gently on, reflecting off the windows, the words on the wall seemed to shine brighter. "Integrity keeps us standing." It wasn't a slogan. It was the truth that had kept them alive. The seasons rolled quietly across Halifax. Summer warmed the harbor with the scent of salt and new beginnings. Autumn painted the streets in rust and gold. Through it all, the foundry kept breathing, steady, alive, unshaken. What had started as survival was now tradition. What had once been a dream was now part of the city's rhythm. By winter, the building no longer felt like a miracle. It felt like it had always been there, part of the landscape, part of the people. And as snow began to fall again over the harbor, its lights stayed on long after dusk, shining through the frost like a promise that refused to fade. A year passed, and Halifax wore winter like a memory, cold, soft, and quietly alive. Snow clung to the edges of the harbor, street lamps flickered against the mist, and at the end of the pier, the Foundry of Hope glowed like a lantern that refused to die. Inside, the air was filled with warmth, the kind that came not from heat, but from belonging. The walls, once scarred by fire, now held hundreds of names, handwritten, painted, etched, part of an annual gathering they called the Night of Names. It had started as Zoe's idea. "Everyone has someone who helped them stand," she'd said, pen clutched in her small hand. "We should remember their names." And so they did. People came from all corners of the city. Immigrants, veterans, students, families, elders, all carrying slips of paper or chalk, each name written with care. Luis brought his father's old toolbox, painting Miguel in bold blue letters. Farah wrote Amira for the aunt who had paid her first semester's tuition. Ellen, hands shaking, wrote the name of her late husband and whispered, "He would have loved this." Every name told a story. Every mark turned the wall into a constellation. Malcolm stood near the center, his jacket dusted with snow, watching as the community grew across the bricks, like vines reclaiming what was once forgotten. Clara stood beside him, clipboard in hand, but she wasn't organizing tonight. She was just there, one more name among the many. Zoe climbed onto the small stage built from salvaged wood and tapped the microphone twice. Her voice, though young, carried with the quiet confidence of someone who'd grown up watching courage disguised as kindness. "This poem," she said, "is for everyone who ever helped someone stand." She looked down at her paper and began, "You can't burn a name that's spoken with kindness. You can't erase a voice that says, 'I see you.' You can paint over walls, tear down buildings, move lines on a map, but light remembers where it was once welcomed, because a name, when spoken with care, is a kind of home, and homes, even when rebuilt, remember who built them." Her voice trembled at the end, and for a heartbeat, the room was silent, the kind of silence that feels sacred. Then, softly at first, the audience began to applaud, not loud, not for show, but steady. A rhythm of hearts recognizing one another. Malcolm felt something shift in his chest. Pride, maybe, or gratitude, or simply the peace of knowing that the story didn't end with him. It had only begun. He looked around. Louis was laughing with a group of apprentices, his hands still stained with paint. Farah was adjusting a solar model for a young girl eager to learn how it worked. Ellen sat beside a teenage boy reading aloud to her from a science book. And Zoe, radiant, fearless Zoe, was now surrounded by children asking her to help them spell their names on the wall. There were no titles here, no divisions, no executives, no volunteers, no single dads. Only people standing where they belonged. Clara nudged him gently. "You see it?" Malcolm nodded slowly. "Yeah. It's what we hoped for." She smiled. "No, it's what you built." He looked at her, eyes soft. "No," he said. "We just remembered how." Outside, the snow fell thicker, muting the city's sounds. From the street, the foundry's tall windows shone golden against the dark, each pane alive with light, each wall etched with names that seemed to glow of their own accord. Down by the docks, the reflection rippled across the water, hundreds of lights trembling, merging, steadying again. It wasn't the kind of brightness that demanded attention. It didn't shout. It didn't blind. It stayed. The camera lingered on the building, on laughter filtering through frosted glass, on the flicker of candles, on the snowflakes catching the yellow light as they fell. Somewhere inside, someone began humming a tune. An old sailor's song, turned lullaby, carried on the wind. And, as the final image settled, the foundry standing strong amid the snow, the words on its wall barely visible but eternal, the voice of Zoe echoed softly in memory. You can't burn a name that's spoken with kindness. The lights dimmed. Only the glow remained, reflected on the harbor, warm against the cold. The light that stayed, the light of dignity, quiet, unyielding, and forever home.